Wednesday, 25th of October, 1854. Crimea. Through the dense, grey, sulphurous smoke of battle, a slow trickle of cavalrymen pick their way through the corpses of men and horses of their fallen comrades. The still living had emotionless, thousand-yard stares on their faces, the sabres hanging limp at their side, dripping with blood, their horses blown and exhausted, flanks streaked with sweat. These were the remnants of one of the biggest and most irresponsible blunders in military history. Today, Descent into Darkness rides into the Valley of Death to examine the charge of the Light Brigade. Background. The Crimean War ranks among one of the most brutal and costly wars in the Victorian era, and to understand what brought us to today's topic, we must have a short-potted history of the build-up. Essentially, the conflict came about as a result of Russia's desire to access ports in the Black Sea and therefore the Mediterranean, opening up trade, of course, but also, and this was one of the sticking points, now having a naval presence in the area. This would upset the balance of power in the Balkans region, and represented a very real threat to the Ottoman Empire. I think Boney M. said it best. Oh, those Russians. This was something that the other major world powers simply could not risk. Britain, France, the Ottomans, and even the Kingdom of Sardinia and Piedmont joined together to prevent the Russian expansion. The Ottomans declared war on Russia on the 16th of October 1853, following assurances of assistance from the other major powers. The Ottomans put up a solid defence and did throw a serious spanner in the works of the advancing Russian army. But very soon, the initial good signs began to show cracks. An Ottoman fleet attempting to reinforce the besieged town of Kars was destroyed by the Russian fleet at the Battle of Sinop. Fearing an imminent Ottoman capitulation, ships from the British and French fleets entered the Black Sea in preparation for war. Britain had a particular penchant for flexing its muscles during the 19th century. No more was this so than under the leadership of Prime Minister Henry John Temple, the Lord Palmerston. He is widely credited with the invention of so-called gunboat politics, meaning the use of military presence in the area of concern, usually in the form of a literal gunboat, as a means of threatening the other belligerent, and it usually worked too. Tensions continued to rise, with Russia refusing British and French demands to withdraw from the region. And so, on the 28th of March 1854, war were declared. Forgive my little nod to see an arsenal here. As has been proven time and again, Russia, of course, had access to a lot of soldiers. Around 889,000 men were mobilized for the conflict. On the flip side, the Allied nations could only call upon a combined total of 674,000 soldiers. However, the phrase quality over quantity was never truer. The majority of the Russian troops were still armed with smoothbore muskets that had an effective range of around 100 yards or so, with accuracy that could be best described with a simple word: no. Whilst that might seem a little disingenuous, compared to their opponents, it was night and day. The British and French, for example, were all armed with rifled muskets, which were a huge step up from the previous generation of firearms. Whilst there was no particular saving in speed of reloading, the spin-stabilised projectiles could punch right out to around 1,200 yards, but most effective up to 300 to 500 yards, still 3 to 5 times further than their Russian counterparts. The Allied forces planned a combined land and sea assault on the Russian-held port of Sevastopol. Boots touched the ground in early September of 1854 and began to advance south on the port. This led to the Battle of the Alma on the 20th of that month. This resulted in a solid Allied victory, forcing the hastily assembled Russian forces back south of the Alma River. A month later, the Russians mounted a counterattack, a few miles southeast of Sevastopol, at a place called Balaclava. The Battle of Balaclava. As dawn broke on the field of engagement on the 25th of October 1854, the Ottoman forces were occupying the summit of the southern side of a valley that lay directly to their front. This summit was known as Causeway Heights and presented a commanding position with artillery pieces in semi-entrenched positions called redoubts. The British and French forces, though small in number, were occupying the rear, centre and left flank of the field. The British were commanded by Fitzroy James Henry Somerset, the Lord Raglan. The battle began early in the morning at around 09:15 when the Russians began with an all-out frontal infantry and artillery attack on the Allied centre. The Ottoman forces, while initially mounting a stiff defence, were unable to hold the position due to a lack of any meaningful numbers in support and were forced to abandon the heights. The Ottomans were pursued by a massed charge of Russian cavalry, who surged forward in the centre and right flank. But once the Russians crested the hill, they were hit hard by a countercharge by the main British Heavy Brigade of cavalry. The Heavy Brigade were made up of the strongest men, armed with heavy, stout-bladed straight swords, and were mounted on the biggest and strongest horses. They were the shock troops of their day. The Russian horsemen completely broke and retreated back over the hill and back down into the valley. The Heavy Brigade chose not to pursue. Following this, from Lord Raglan's vantage point, he and his staff could see the Russians were attempting to drag away the Ottoman guns from the redoubts on the left side of Causeway Heights. Quickly recognizing the advantage in denying the enemy the opportunity to capture and redeploy their artillery, Raglan hurriedly told one of his staff officers, the rather impatient and highly ambitious Canadian-born Captain Louis Nolan, to take a message to the commander of his light cavalry brigade, Lord Cardigan. Nolan immediately set off for Cardigan's position, over half a mile away. Captain Nolan found the light brigade of horsemen and made a beeline for Lord Cardigan. After a quick exchange of greetings, Nolan informed Cardigan that Lord Raglan sent his compliments and relayed the orders thusly. Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. Troop horse artillery may accompany. French cavalry is on your left immediate. However, the problem was that, from his position, Cardigan did not have a line of sight to the guns that Raglan meant, causing much confusion. Cardigan simply did not understand where he was supposed to go, and asked Nolan to return to Raglan for clarification of the orders. In a fit of impetuous desperation, and knowing that time was of the utmost essence if the move was to succeed, Nolan threw his arm over his shoulder without looking and angrily shouted, "There, my lord! There are your guns!" Cardigan looked again, but from his vantage point, the only guns that he could see was the artillery battery at the far end of the valley, around 1800 yards away. Thinking that this must be the one that Raglan was referring to in the orders, and no doubt feeling hurried by the excitable Captain Nolan, he dutifully ordered his men to form line and prepare. The charge. The men and horses of the Light Brigade quickly chivied themselves into three lines, the harsh metallic rasp of sabres being drawn, and with the light glittering off the polished steel, the first line of horses spurred away at a walk. After they had covered around 50 paces, the next line started off, followed by the next line 50 paces after that. Not long after the brigade had poured down into the valley floor and had wheeled right, they quickly came under enfilading fire from the artillery batteries that flanked either side of the high walls of the valley. Captain Nolan had realized the mistake and had spurred his horse on to try to tell Cardigan that he was heading the wrong way, but as he hurriedly galloped down the right side of the three lines to reach Cardigan, one of the first Russian shells fired exploded right next to the young officer, eviscerating him and his horse. The message did not get through. The Russians fired explosive shells and solid round shot at the greater distances, but as the gap closed, they switched to a much more devastating device, canister. This was a thin-walled tin can filled with 1-ounce musket balls that were designed to burst at the muzzle of the gun and fan out the balls like a gigantic shotgun. All of these caused horrific injuries to both horse and man. Even if the rider was uninjured, a falling horse could easily crush its rider or trap them underneath. The majority of an old-fashioned cavalry charge was done in 4 phases. Initially, they would start at a walk for the first half to a third or so of the distance. Next, they would speed up to a trot pace for the next quarter. The next would be at a canter, and then the final 100 to 200 yards would be at a full gallop. This preserved the horse's energy until the last. The attack was described by one of its participants, Captain Godfrey Morgan, thusly. The first shell burst in the air about 100 yards in front of us. The next one dropped in front of Nolan's horse and exploded on touching the ground. He uttered a wild yell as his horse turned about, and with his arms extended, the reins dropped onto the animal's neck. He trotted towards us, but in a few yards he dropped dead off his horse. I do not imagine that anyone except those in the front line of the 17th Lancers saw what had happened. We went on. When we got about 200 or 300 yards, the battery of the Russian horse artillery opened fire. I do not recollect hearing a word from anyone as we gradually broke from the trot to a canter, though the noise of the striking of men and horses by grape and round shot was deafening, while the dust and gravel struck up by the round shot that fell short was almost blinding, and irritated my horse so that I could scarcely hold him at all. But as we came nearer, I could plainly see enough, especially when I was about 100 yards from the guns. I appeared to be riding straight into the muzzle of one of those guns, and I distinctly saw the gunner apply the fuse. I shut my eyes then, for I thought that settled the question as far as I was concerned, but the shot just missed and struck the man on my right full in the chest. In another minute I was on the gun, and the leading Russian's grey horse, shot, I suppose, with a pistol by someone on my right, fell across my horse, dragging it over with him and pinning me in between the gun and himself. A Russian gunner on foot at once covered me with his carbine. He was just within reach of my sword, and I struck him across the neck. The blow did not do much harm, but it disconcerted his aim. At the same time, a mounted gunner struck my horse in the forehead with his sabre. Spurring Sir Briggs, he half jumped, half blundered over the fallen horses, and then, for a short time, bolted with me. I only remember finding myself alone among the Russians, trying to get out as best I could. This, by some chance, I did, in spite of all attempts of the Russians to cut me down. Albeit depleted, the large wall of blue horsemen smashed into the line of guns. Sabres slashed wildly at the now near defenceless gunners, cutting many of them down within seconds. However, this success was short-lived, as Russian Cossacks and Hussar cavalry formed a counter-charge which quickly stymied the momentum of the British cavalry, who, seeing the untenable situation, sounded the retreat. However, this of course meant going back the way they had come, through a further hail of cannonade. Although by this point the volume of fire from the enfilading guns had been greatly reduced from the right-hand side of the valley, thanks to the supporting charge by men of the French 4e Chasseurs d'Afrique. Captain Godfrey Morgan continued in his recollection. When clear again of the guns, I saw 2 or 3 of my men making their way back, and as the fire from both flanks was still heavy, it was a matter of running the gauntlet again. I have not sufficient recollection of minor incidents to describe them, as probably no 2 men who were in that charge would describe them in the same way. When I was back pretty nearly where we started from, I found that I was the senior officer of those not wounded, and consequently in command, there being only 2 others, both junior to me, in the same position, Lieutenant Wombwell and Cornet Cleveland. The survivors made it back to where they had started, picking up some walking wounded on the way. Many of the riderless or wounded horses that were still standing dutifully attempted to limp their way along, following the other horses as they had been trained to do. The Light Brigade had not been destroyed, but it had been severely blooded, and would take no further part in the battle. Aftermath. When the butcher's bill was tallied, a total of 278 casualties were recorded, with 118 killed and 122 wounded, and 60 taken prisoner. On top of this, we must also not forget the 355 horses lost also. A total of 40% casualty rate. The Russian gunners had lost only 33 killed and wounded. By the time the majority of the survivors had returned to their original positions, it was only midday. The whole event, from start point to return to start point, was only around 20 minutes. It turned out that the Heavy Brigade under George Bingham, the Lord Lucan, yes, the great-grandfather of that Lord Lucan, were supposed to be in support of their colleagues, and although they had assembled at the mouth of the valley, Lucan had chosen not to advance any further, his reasoning being that he saw little point in adding to the already large number of casualties. Ultimately, the charge of the Light Brigade had gained a sum total of nothing. The Russians kept their artillery pieces in exchange for a few killed and wounded gunners, which could be replaced more readily than a cannon, carriage and caisson. Lord Cardigan, despite being in the front line, was one of those lucky enough to have survived the charge. A photograph of the survivors of the 13th Light Dragoon Regiment was taken not long after the battle. They'd been reduced down to only 22. The Allied forces would go on to win the day, but the success was marred by the disastrous phase that was the charge. Legacy. The charge of the Light Brigade serves as a lesson in ensuring that orders are given clearly and unambiguously. One could only imagine the look of horror on Lord Raglan's face when he saw them file down in the wrong direction and begin their advance on the artillery battery. Moreover, one can imagine the bowel-loosening feeling of fear and anxious apprehension on the faces of the men themselves as they realized what they had been ordered to do. And yet, nevertheless, they did their duty, and many paid the ultimate price. Of course, this individual part of the battle was a humiliating defeat, but it has gone down in history for the utter futility of it, and for the minerals of the cavalrymen who took part in it. Brass balls of such gargantuan proportions, I'm surprised the poor horses could even carry them. However, despite this awful phase, the Battle of Balaclava would result in an Allied victory, as would the whole campaign. Russia would be beaten again at the Battle of Inkerman on the 5th of November, only a short distance from Balaclava, and the last line of defence before Sebastopol, which fell on the 11th of September 1855, and eventually the Russians would sue for peace in 1856 with the Treaty of Paris. The Crimean War was the first major conflict to be reported on in near real time by journalists who were able to write their pieces and have them telegraphed back to London within hours. During the Napoleonic Wars around 50 years earlier, the public would only hear about actions that took place weeks or even months ago, but now they could read the details of something that only happened a day or two ago. This was a huge breakthrough for journalism and has only gone from strength to strength ever since. The reputation of the British cavalry went through the roof when the news of the charge was filtered back. It was seen as an heroic action in the face of adversity and a representation of British grit and determination. The infantry would also get their own little boost in reputation due to another, more successful phase of the Battle of Balaclava, when the men of the 93rd Highland Regiment withstood a massed cavalry charge by the Russians. This was the same attack that had been repulsed by the Heavy Brigade earlier in the day. 4 squadrons of around 400 men had peeled off from the main attack that had met the Heavy Brigade to attack the 93rd, who were bolstered by some hastily assembled Ottoman reinforcements. The prevailing doctrine left over from the Napoleonic age was that infantry were best to form a square with bayonets fixed. Horses would naturally and understandably shy away from the wall of spikes. However, on this occasion, the infantry remained in their 2-rank line to maximize their firepower. As a result, the Russian horsemen were not able to break through. This event became known as the Thin Red Line, and has become perhaps the greatest image of the Victorian British Army, a valiant and victorious action against the odds, right up there with the later Battle of Rorke's Drift in 1879, certainly a topic for a future video. On an interesting side note, the war did not technically fully end until 1966. How, may you ask? Well, due to a particular quirk of the UK, the declaration of war with Russia contained the phrasing, "Victoria, Queen of Britain, Ireland, Berwick-upon-Tweed, and her dominions beyond the sea." However, in the resultant peace treaty, the small border town of Berwick-upon-Tweed was not mentioned, meaning that they were technically still at war with Russia. For clarification here, Berwick has always been a bit of a sticking point in English and Scottish politics. It lies on the north bank of the River Tweed, in the east of the British Isles, placing it inside the physical territory of Scotland. However, ownership of it has long been disputed, and so it was decided that it should be spoken of as being of the United Kingdom, but not in it. Hence its specific inclusion in the declaration of war. This being despite the fact that a law had been passed in 1746 that did away with the requirement to specifically mention them. I guess old habits really do die hard. The omission of Berwick from the peace treaty was not realised until 1966. The then Soviet government was contacted for an official signing of a separate peace treaty between Russia and the wee border town. There is a story circulating that it had all been sorted out back in 1914, but when asked for details in December of 1965, the Foreign Office did not confirm whether it had been or not. Therefore, an official ceremony was held to sign the document, and upon completion, the Mayor of Berwick said to the Russian ambassador as they shook hands, "Now at last you may tell the Russian people to sleep peacefully in their beds." Much to the hilarity of all present. See, this is why no one does sarcastic comedy quite like the British. For those of you wondering, nowadays Berwick-upon-Tweed is administratively considered part of England, but their football team is allowed to play in the Scottish League due to travelling distances being easier for both sets of fans. I should also point out that the last survivor of the Crimean War did not shuffle off their mortal coil and go off to join the Choir Invisible until the year 2004. However, this is a bit of a cheat, as they were not human. The British Royal Navy ship HMS Queen had a tortoise named Timothy as its onboard mascot, and served as such on board throughout the entire campaign. Although amusingly, it was latterly discovered that Timothy was, in fact, a female, but then who am I to judge? You do you, Timothy, and rest in peace. I should also address something which will inevitably come up in the comments section. It is often said that the Russian cannons captured during the Crimean War were melted down and used to make the newly instituted Victoria Cross, the highest award for gallantry in the British Armed Forces. Whilst this may have been true for the first examples up to the turn of the 20th century, metallurgical study of examples from the First World War and since have been determined to be of Chinese origin, most likely captured during the First Opium War of 1839–42. Given that this predates the Crimean conflict, it is therefore more likely that all of them were from this source. So when you hear about VCs being cast from Russian guns, please take that with a punch of salt. Incidentally, once the Victoria Cross was fully instituted, 9 of them were awarded to members of the British forces for their actions at the Battle of Balaclava. All of them were cavalrymen. John Berryman, 17th Duke of Cambridge Own Lancers, Alexander Dunn, 11th Prince Albert's Own Hussars, John Farrell, 17th Duke of Cambridge Own Lancers, John Grieve, 2nd Dragoons, the Royal Scots Greys, Joseph Malone, 17th Light Dragoons, James Mout, 6th Enniskillen Dragoons, Samuel Parks, 4th Light Dragoons, Henry Ramage, 2nd Dragoons, the Royal Scots Greys, and Charles Wooden, 17th Duke of Cambridge Own Lancers. When it comes to apportioning blame for the blunder, we cannot pin it down all on one single incident, more a series of unfortunate events and one act of inaction. Captain Nolan should have been more specific and taken his time to fully explain what Lord Raglan had wanted. To have ambiguously gestured over his shoulder was simply nowhere near good enough. To his credit, though, he did attempt to rectify the mistake, but was killed whilst trying to do so. Lord Cardigan made no attempt to clarify with Nolan by asking if indeed he meant the guns that he could see at the other end of the valley, and Lord Lucan for not charging in support, which could well have provided a huge amount of support to the light units and counter the countercharge of the Russian horsemen. It could well be argued that the presence of the heavy units could well have secured and consolidated the captured positions until further support could have arrived, especially when one takes the nearby French chasseurs into account. However, this comes with a caveat that cavalry, ideally, needs the support of infantry nearby if they are to hold gained territory, as they lacked ranged weapons, so could easily be driven off. Certainly points for debate in the comments section, and I relish the prospect of reading your thoughts on these points. The charge of the Light Brigade was immortalised by the fantastic poet Alfred Lord Tennyson and is a most brilliant piece of prose. I shall close out the video for you with my own rendition of this iconic poem. Half a league onward, all into the valley of death rode the 600. "Forward the Light Brigade! Charge for the guns!" he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. "Forward the Light Brigade!" Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army, while all the world wondered, plunged in the battery's smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that fought so well came through the jaws of death, and back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of the 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made! All the world wondered. Honour the charge they made! Honour the Light Brigade! Noble 600. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing to help the channel reach further and wider. Drop a comment down below and tell me what you think about the charge of the Light Brigade. And furthermore, which military blunders would you like to see me cover in future? Lord knows there's plenty to choose from. And I know there will be more than a few comments talking about more modern occurrences involving Russia, but I shall not be drawn into discussing that. Although perhaps one day, when the dust has finally settled, that particular chapter may well be getting DID treatment, but that day is certainly not yet. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon, link in the description, or if you prefer to go down the one-off donation route, you can donate via the Super Thanks button. Better still, you can visit the DID merch store and pick yourself up some sweet swag in a large variety of choice colours. The channel Q&A will be coming up soon, so head down to the pinned comment below this video to submit your questions for me to answer. And if you crave even more of me, darling, please take a gander at my back catalogue of videos and pop on over to my alternate channel DID Reads, where I post renditions of poetry, both serious and funny, along with famous speeches such as the Gettysburg Address, for example. I will be going away for a couple of long weekends in April, so please forgive me if I slow down a tad in my uploading of new stuff for this month. Rest assured, everything will be back to normal for May, but I am in serious need of some R&R, especially after the house move. Keep an eye out on the community tab, and I may even post a few pics of where I'm going. You know I just can't quit you, even on holiday. In the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.